She conquered Egypt, not with diplomacy, not with inheritance, not because Rome was distracted. She sent an army, killed the Roman prefect in the field, and took the most valuable province in the empire. Then she took Syria, then Anatolia, then most of the eastern Mediterranean. In 3 years, a queen from a desert city in Syria controlled 1/3 of the Roman Empire, and the Roman emperor had to come himself to get it back. Every civilization that existed in her era knew her name. The Romans wrote about her for centuries. The coins she minted circulated from Egypt to the Euphrates. A Roman emperor wrote a personal letter defending himself for taking her seriously. And modern history gave her a paragraph. Here is what they left out of that paragraph. Aurelian's own letter to the Roman Senate, written after her capture, preserved in the Historia Augusta, available to every historian who built the Western curriculum, lists her qualities in detail, as though presenting evidence in a trial. Wisdom, military discipline, steadfastness under pressure, generosity to her soldiers. He signed his name to it. That letter is in Act 5. What it reveals about who made the decision to erase her, and when, changes what this story is actually about. In 270 AD, the Roman prefect of Egypt, Probus, sent a naval force up the Nile to stop an invading army. He lost. He died in the field. And Egypt, the grain supply of the entire Roman Empire, changed hands inside a single military campaign. The Roman Empire did not lose Egypt easily. It had held Egypt for 300 years. Egypt was not a province like the others. It was the mechanism. Whoever controlled the grain flowing out of Alexandria controlled the hunger of Rome itself. The emperors knew this so well that they made it illegal for senators to travel there without permission. Too dangerous to let powerful men near something that valuable. Probus was not an amateur. He was an experienced military commander. According to Zosimus's New History, written around 500 AD and drawing on earlier imperial records, Probus moved decisively, deploying forces both overland and by sea, and was still defeated. The Palmyrene general who killed him was named Zabdas. The campaign had been designed by a queen. She was not in Egypt watching. She was in Palmyra, coordinating. Within the same campaigning season, Palmyrene forces moved north into Syria and west into Anatolia. Within 18 months, they had absorbed roughly 1/3 of Roman imperial territory. Not through negotiation, not through inheritance, not through a political vacuum, through organized military campaigns that defeated Rome's professional legions in open field. The Roman emperor at the time, Claudius II, was fighting the Goths on the Danube. He died of plague before he could respond. His successor, Quintillus, lasted weeks. The empire cycled through 2 emperors while Palmyra was absorbing the east. None of this appears in most Western history curricula. It is not in the standard textbook chapter on the crisis of the 3rd century. When it is mentioned, it is described as a regional rebellion, a temporary disruption. A regional rebellion does not kill Roman prefects, take Egypt, and hold it for 2 years. And then there's Longinus. The official version of Zenobia begins and ends in the same place. She was a rebel queen who overreached. The standard account is not without merit. It is coherent. It is supported by Roman sources. It is, in the way all simplified histories are, partially true. Palmyra was a client kingdom, a city-state in the Syrian desert that had served Rome loyally for generations. Its strategic position on the Silk Road trade routes made it wealthy. Its rulers held Roman citizenship. Zenobia's husband, Odaenathus, had been appointed by Rome to defend the eastern frontier after the humiliation of Emperor Valerian. The only Roman emperor ever captured alive by a foreign power, taken prisoner by the Persian king Shapur I in 260 AD. Odenathus did what Rome could not do itself. He drove the Persians back. He stabilized the East. He was rewarded with titles, recognition, and effective autonomy. When he was assassinated in 267 or 268 AD, the circumstances remain disputed. Zenobia became regent for her young son, Babylathus. According to the official framing, she then grew ambitious, overextended, and was corrected by Aurelian. That is the structure of the story most people inherit. It is a story about a capable administrator who miscalculated. The temperature of the eastern frontier that spring was not the only thing Rome had miscalculated. What Rome, and later the historians who wrote about Rome, consistently failed to account for was the scale of what Zenobia had actually built before Aurelian arrived. Not the scale of her ambition, the scale of her administration. Palmyra under Zenobia issued its own coinage. Zenobia and Babylathus appeared on coins alongside the Roman emperors, but with Palmyrene titles that carried no Roman authorization. The coins minted in Alexandria after the conquest show Babylathus on one side and Zenobia on the other. No Roman emperor appears. This is not the coinage of a rebel. This is the coinage of an alternative empire. The Historia Augusta, a late Roman collection of imperial biographies, includes a full Vita Zenobiae, a dedicated life of Zenobia, written with the kind of specificity that Rome reserved for figures it considered historically significant. She is described as speaking Egyptian, Greek, Latin, and Aramaic, as personally reviewing troop dispositions, as corresponding with the philosopher Cassius Longinus, who served as her chief intellectual advisor. She held court in Palmyra, according to Persian imperial ritual. She dressed in the manner of Roman emperors. She referred to herself as Queen of the East. Aurelian did not march against a regional administrator who had overstepped. He marched against a peer. She built an empire. That's the word in every primary source. Not a rebellion, not an uprising, not an overreach. An empire. Aurelian understood this. His response was not a suppression campaign. It was a full imperial offensive. He marched from the Danube in 272 AD with the largest Roman force assembled since the wars of Claudius. He did not send a general. He went himself. According to Pat Southern's Empress Zenobia, Palmyra's Rebel Queen, 2008, drawing on Zosimus and the Historia Augusta, Aurelian's campaign required rerouting grain supplies, negotiating passage through client kingdoms, and fighting multiple pitched battles before reaching Palmyrene territory. The first major engagement was at Imme, near Antioch. The Palmyrene cavalry, heavy cataphracts, some of the best armored cavalry in the ancient world, charged the Roman lines and appeared to break them. The Romans retreated. The Palmyrenes pursued. They had been lured forward. The Roman cavalry turned, re-engaged the Palmyrene horsemen when their momentum had exhausted them, and destroyed them in detail. It was a planned, tactical trap against an adversary serious enough to warrant one. Zenobia was present at Imme. She withdrew in good order to Emesa. The second battle at Emesa went worse for Palmyra. Roman infantry held the cataphract charge long enough for the flanks to close. She withdrew again, this time to Palmyra itself. What happened next is documented in the Historia Augusta, with a detail that most summaries omit entirely. Before the siege of Palmyra, Aurelian wrote to Zenobia offering terms. He wrote to her, "The Roman emperor, with the largest army in the east at his back, opened a negotiation." Her response, preserved in the Historia Augusta and cited by Nathaniel Andrade in Zenobia, Shooting Star of Palmyra, 2018, is one of the most remarkable documents from the 3rd century. You demand my surrender as though you did not know that Cleopatra preferred death to life in dishonor. She compared herself to Cleopatra, not as humility, as a standard. Aurelian's letter exists. Zenobia's response exists. The siege of Palmyra exists. And somewhere in that sequence is a document that reframes everything about how this story ends. Palmyra fell in late 272 AD. Zenobia attempted to escape east toward Persia, seeking allies. Roman cavalry intercepted her at the Euphrates. She was captured before she crossed. The Historia Augusta records what happened at the moment of capture, and what did not happen. Aurelian did not execute her. This requires a moment of explanation. Because in the Roman system, the standard outcome for a captured enemy leader of significance was death. Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who defeated Julius Caesar at Gergovia, was held for 6 years and then strangled before Caesar's triumph. Cleopatra, who Zenobia had invoked in her letter, killed herself before Octavian could parade her. Jugurtha of Numidia was led through Rome and starved to death in the Tullianum prison. The pattern was established. The defeated enemy of Rome died, publicly, in service of the victor's narrative. Aurelian broke the pattern. He dressed Zenobia in chains of gold, literal golden chains, documented in the Historia Augusta, and placed her at the center of his triumph in Rome. The gold was not mercy. The gold was the point. Iron chains were for enemies who had been defeated. Gold chains were for someone the crowd needed to understand had been worth defeating. She walked through Rome in gold chains so that Rome would know what Rome had conquered. But what happened after the triumph is where the official record becomes interesting. According to the Historia Augusta, Aurelian granted Zenobia a villa in Tibur, modern Tivoli, outside Rome. She lived there. She remarried, possibly to a Roman senator. She had daughters. She may have lived into the 280s. She was not killed. She was not imprisoned. She was installed. Cassius Longinus, the philosopher who had served as her chief advisor, the man introduced in Act 2, was not so fortunate. He was executed after the fall of Palmyra. Aurelian specifically blamed him for reinforcing Zenobia's resistance. According to Zosimus, Longinus went to his death calmly, consoling those around him. The intellectual was killed. The queen was given a house in the suburbs of Rome. This asymmetry has occupied historians for centuries. Pat Southern reads it as pragmatic mercy. Zenobia as a living trophy was more useful than a dead martyr. Nathaniel Andrade reads it as evidence of genuine Roman respect, even admiration, for someone who had built something formidable enough to require Aurelian himself to dismantle it. There is a third reading, and it comes from Aurelian's own words. The document that changes everything is not Zenobia's letter, though that letter is remarkable. It is a letter from Aurelian to the Roman Senate, preserved in the Historia Augusta. The Senate had mocked him. Senators had written, or Aurelian believed they had written, questioning why the greatest military emperor of his age had devoted so much personal attention, so many legions, so much of a campaign season, to a woman. Aurelian wrote back. The letter, cited by David Stone Potter in The Roman Empire at Bay, 2004, reads, in the translation scholars rely on, I hear that men are reproaching me for having performed an unmanly deed in leading Zenobia in triumph. But those very persons who find fault with me now would accord me praise in abundance, did they but know what manner of woman she is, how wise in counsels, how steadfast in plans, how firm toward the soldiers, how generous when necessity calls, and how stern when discipline demands it. A Roman emperor writing in self-defense to his own Senate. defending himself for taking a woman seriously. He listed her qualities: wisdom, steadfastness, military discipline, generosity, as though presenting evidence in a trial. He signed it. This letter was available to every historian who built the Western canon of classical history. It sat in the Historia Augusta, copied in monasteries across medieval Europe, printed in the early modern period, cited in Latin scholarship from the Renaissance onward. The decision to give Zenobia one paragraph was not made because the sources were thin. The sources were not thin. The decision was made. The erasure of Zenobia is not ancient. That is the thing worth sitting with. The Roman sources, Zosimus, the Historia Augusta, the coins, the papyri from Egypt, document her extensively. The 3rd century record is not silent. If anything, by the standards of ancient women, it is unusually loud. The reduction happened in the 18th and 19th centuries, when European scholars systematized classical history into the canon that universities still teach. The men who built that canon were selecting which figures mattered, which wars defined civilization, which leaders deserved chapters, and which deserved footnotes. Those selections were not neutral. They reflected assumptions about who could lead, who could build, and what kind of power was worth remembering. Zenobia did not fit the template. So she was compressed into the template, a queen who rebelled and was captured, and the template moved on. The consequence is not merely biographical, it is structural. When we tell the story of Rome's 3rd century crisis without Zenobia at its center, we get the wrong story. We get an empire battered by external pressures and internal incompetence, somehow surviving. What actually happened is more specific. Rome nearly lost its eastern provinces permanently to an organized state that was not Persia, not the Goths, not a migration. A state built in a generation by one administrator who understood that Rome's attention was fragmented and moved into the gap. That is a different lesson. It is a lesson about the speed at which power can be built when an institution is distracted. It is a lesson about what regional instability actually looks like when someone decides to exploit it systematically. It is a lesson that, for obvious reasons, empires prefer not to teach. Someone chose which stories survived the curriculum. The question is whether we keep letting them choose. Aurelian's letter to the Senate is still there. It has always been there. The question history never asks is not, why was Zenobia erased? The question is simpler. Who decided the erasure was acceptable? Not one person, not one century. A long chain of educated men who looked at the evidence and chose, again and again, to leave it where they found it. There is a word for a source that exists and is not used. It is not lost. It is not suppressed. It is ignored, which is a quieter thing and harder to explain and harder to reverse. Zenobia built an empire in 3 years. Rome spent 2 years and an emperor's personal attention dismantling it. She walked through Rome in golden chains, so the crowd would understand what had been conquered. And then she retired to a villa outside the city, outliving Aurelian himself. The record is clear. The choice was not to use it. If a Roman emperor's own letter defending himself for taking a woman seriously was buried for 17 centuries, what else are we still leaving in the archive? Tell me in the comments.